Good morning and welcome, everybody. I know you're my heroes now because Saturday morning, 9 a.m. Thank you, James, you're there. So welcome to this second day of our colloquium, Theory and Political Theology, Ways to Overcome Polarization. And today we begin with an exciting panel on theological anthropology and the primacy of grace. It's a gift and a task. The coordinator of this topic has been Karanovich, a recent graduate of BC and now a young professor. Congratulations. Yeah, good. And the session will be moderated by Madeline, Jarrett. Welcome. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Okay, welcome everyone to our first roundtable today on anthropology and grace. Our first presenter is Dr. Karanovich. Zach is an assistant professor of theology at Mount Mary University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Just over 6 months ago, he completed his PhD in systematic theology under Brian Robinette here at Boston College with a dissertation entitled Conversion in a World of Violence, James Allison, Thomas Merton, and the Stories That Change Us. In addition to some of the themes you will hear in his presentation this morning, his theological interests include political theology, spirituality, and the most recent addition, the role of humor in theological pedagogy. Zach's paper is entitled A Radical Revision, Grace, Narrative, and the Possibilities for Me and Us.
I don't. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for your attendance this morning, and thanks to those on the panel with me and sharing this conversation. I was asked to give a couple of comments situating this conversation this morning, and I think that the interest in anthropology and grace, at least for me, emerges from questions that you'll hear presented in my paper. What does it mean to be a human being? How do we do it better? And what help do we need to do that? And I think we'll see themes of that emerging in John and John's papers. So I'm grateful that they're here with me this morning and for Maddie's participation, for the invitation to be a part of it. So without further ado. In April of last year, Commonweal published a piece by Mark Phillips called Elegy for My People. In the article, Phillips describes growing up in his white working class hometown. Among those in his hometown were hardworking, proud, and loyal men and women whose lives were dedicated to the mill or meals and to ensuring their families were warm and well fed. But the community was not immune to bigotry. The bigotry was instead, he writes, quote, a kind of family tradition. Further, he, quote, learned various slurs against people of other races and ethnicities in the neighborhood and at school, even from his football coach. After moving away from that town to teach college, Phillips writes, quote, the shared identity of these men remained partially mine even while I was teaching college. I kept close my heritage of pride and stubbornness, loyalty to family, and charitable duty to neighbors and friends. In other words, his life reflected a gratitude for the virtuous wisdom he received. But the less virtuous underside still lingered too, complicating that relationship. He writes, it is supercilious to confess the sins of others or to generalize about an entire class of people. Such generalizations too often warrant another kind of bigotry. In any case, the unignorable fact, troubling or comforting, depending on one's point of view, is that bigotry, an ugly vice, can coexist with virtue. And he continues in this vein. By discounting the sacrifices made by flawed members of my family, I would fail to acknowledge that while all humans are fallen and some much farther than others, most are also open to love. How can I not forgive my kin for their bigotry? One good answer would be that such forgiveness is not mine to give. So perhaps my question should be, how can I not love them? Indeed, how can we not love them? When I first read the article, I thought that I could have written one just like it, almost word for word. I love my small rural Indiana hometown, but I am pained by their past, which includes some very troubling racist episodes, and their present, especially their continued support for politicians who fan those flames. How am I to reconcile all of the wonderful wisdom I learned from being raised by hardworking small town folks with all that other baggage? If we make this question a bit more concrete, we simply ask, how can we overcome violence in a way that does not result in further violence? That is, how do we not just turn the tables? In the particular context of rural working class white communities, we can think of two types of violence that might emerge from those communities in particular, though not unique ways. Racial resentment, the indirect though more pervasive form of racism, and polarization of the ecclesial and political variety. I raised this question in my dissertation. Some of you were there to hear that. And I turned to two theological thinkers for the answers, Thomas Merton and James Allison. And the answer I discovered has less to do with some of them I might desire to change, and instead has a lot more to do with me. I will not replay here my dissertation defense in full. We can all breathe a sigh of relief. But this is the humor and theological pedagogy thing, right? Okay, great. But let me sketch a few of the fundamental pieces to help us advance this argument. I asserted with psychologists, philosophers, and others, including Allison, that the human being is the storytelling animal. We understand ourselves and our world through narratives. And in addition to the story of which we are more conscious, like those we tell when asked about ourselves, there is also, according to sociologist Arlie Russell Hochschild, a deep story, which is a feels as if story. It's the stories feelings tell in the language of symbols. It removes judgment. It removes facts. It tells us how things feel. If prompted, we could articulate or recognize an accurate articulation of the deep story, but more often the deep story is a set of themes that, among other things, can subconsciously curtail our identities and willingness to move beyond our horizons. We learn from mimetic theory that these stories come from the social other. We absorb our identities, worldviews, allies, and enemies from those we imitate, and notably absent from this imitation is any filter for accuracy. It doesn't matter whether the stories are true or false, only that they are commonly held. If we take a page from Bernard Lonergan, I'm not opening that for further question, we see that biases accompany those narratives we take as our own, and those biases come with violence. Johann Galtung was the inspiration for my understanding of violence. With him, I've considered violence to be that human element that results in a disparity between the way things could be and the way that things are. While not all biased narratives result in violence, all violence is the result of some biased narrative. In the case of racial resentment, legitimizing racial myths, that is, those stereotypes and caricatures of races and ethnicities that we all know, though we're not quite sure how we all know them, foster that resentment. In the case of polarization, negative partisanship, whether between Democrat or Republican or progressive or traditional Catholic, causes those divides to worsen. The results? Ongoing systemic racism and a chasm that divides both the nation and the body of Christ. The solution, it appears, is conversion. Lonergan defines conversion as, quote, the movement into a new horizon that involves an about face. It comes out of the old by repudiating characteristic features. It begins a new sequence that can keep revealing ever greater depth and breadth and wealth. Although an about face sounds instantaneous, Lonergan and Allison both acknowledge conversion as a process. To change characteristic features in persons who are natural storytellers then means we are revising our narratives. And given the severity of the violence in our world, we must be open to a radical revision. And here, Allison offers us important insights. And I would like to highlight a few of those insights with regard to understanding grace's role in conversion. Then I will note a few more insights relative to conversion at a communal level, drawn from Allison's discussion of the church's role in that revision process. And then I will conclude by returning to some reflections on home. As we heard yesterday afternoon, at the heart of conversion in Allison's thought is the experience of the resurrection and Jesus' offer of forgiveness, gratuitous forgiveness, and unconditional love. It is this offer of forgiveness and love, what we'll also call God's grace, that invites us into the process of our recreation, being transformed over time into who God intends us to be. The offered grace of forgiveness must also be received by those being forgiven. Allison tips us off to the sign of forgiveness is reception, and one of the most beautiful of Allison's images, the broken heart. Quote, in the most traditional framework of theology, Allison writes, forgiveness precedes confession, and the form which forgiveness takes in the life of a person is contrition, that is, a breaking of heart, a deep shift in attitudinal patterns of the sort. The broken heart, Allison argues, is the beginning of the process of becoming recreated. He writes again, this breaking of heart is eventually received as an extraordinary gift, that of being given to be someone else who I didn't know myself to be, and who is much bigger and more splendid than what I took myself to be. Forgiveness and its reception are a process of opening ourselves up to receive, and a process of understanding that grace and the responsibilities that flow from it. This responsibility is our own imitation of the forgiveness and unconditional love Jesus gives us. That is, we mediate God's grace too. After Jesus' ascension, we no longer experience the risen Jesus in the same mode as the apostles. Instead, we rely on the inheritance of this apostolic witness received in the church and through the Spirit, who continues to change us in our relationships. These changes are, quote, an eruption into our lives of gratuity as forgiveness, permitting a recasting of relationships. It is a fundamental reframing of our relationships, an inspiration and challenge to be in relationships in a radically new way, a real challenge in our polarized times. One of the temptations ever present in any conversion experience is that the conversion merely recreates or reinforces the old system. Resentment, however, obstructs grace and can stall or stop or hinder our own conversion process. As Allison writes, quote, our holding on to what has been done to us makes it impossible for another to speak us into being. Allison's concern is that instead of considering evil those from whom we are converting and perpetuating the old system, we should strive to, quote, become able to be merciful and gentle with them as part of helping them and ourselves to unattach and be reattached. If conversion is a process of the practice of forgiveness, giving and receiving, and of grace, receiving and mediating, then our relationship with those from whom we have converted does not end, but is essential to the process of conversion, ours and theirs. The process of conversion through the practice of forgiveness, again, our reception and mediation of God's grace, is an alteration of our story. Quote, the I that is hidden with Christ in God, Allison argues, little by little and somewhat tentatively begins to build a new life story in the midst of the ruins of the previous collapse. We are offered the opportunity to create our story anew, to create the story in such a way that we model ourselves after the life of Christ, the foundational truths of the gospel. But this new story, which includes gratuitous forgiveness and unconditional love, is a more difficult story to tell than the old black and white story of the old system. Allison writes, quote, the old story was easy to tell because it was always a story over against others, with goodies and baddies, the taking of positions, and the desire to be a hero or a victim, or both at the same time. The new story has no clear script, though it does have a short preface. The preface is one of being killed and finding oneself held in a life that can no longer be destroyed. The old story included clear lines, obvious in-groups and out-groups, and it afforded its adherents the opportunity to exclude those who acted outside of those clear boundaries. Think Fox News or MSNBC. The new story includes significantly more nuance, as it acknowledges the complexity of human persons and their activity in the world. Think PBS NewsHour. It recognizes human limitations and the strength of the old system's pull. The resurrection has radically transformed our understanding of the basics of our social reality and our participation in them. So the changing of the story is a work in progress for those followers of Jesus as we continue the process of conversion, of being recreated. So for Allison, conversion is initiated in the eruption of grace into our lives, in the encounter with the resurrected and forgiving Jesus that breaks our hearts and opens it to being filled anew. It revises our narratives over time in a way that is not necessarily or always clear, but in nuanced and complex ways. What is clear is that we are not tasked with the condemnation of those who have not yet begun that process. Instead, that revision continues through our own mediation of that same grace to others and a whole heap of hope. For Allison, the church plays an important role in the process of conversion, and his reflections on that point are informative for our purposes as we try to navigate the relationships with those from whom we received our first narratives, violent though they may have been. As noted earlier, our encounter with the risen Jesus can no longer be direct in the way it was with the disciples who accompanied him. Instead, Allison argues our experience of Jesus is through the apostolic witness memorialized in the New Testament. So it is textual, that is, we encounter the risen Jesus in the texts, and the curator and keeper of those texts is the church, so it is also institutional. In the institution of the church, Allison writes, we receive our new identity, quote, precisely by participation in the gratuitous ecclesial reception of identity from the forgiving victim, the reception of a social belonging that is completely removed from any sense of self-justification. This identity, Allison argues, is gained by receiving and offering forgiveness, the practice of forgiveness. Conversion, then, is, as he says, intrinsically ecclesial. Our primary experience of this community of the church is at the Eucharistic liturgy. Allison states, because it is the celebration of the presence of the crucified and risen Lord, whose resurrection is our forgiveness, it is also the place of our conversion. It is the community in which we rid ourselves of the old system and practice the new. It is the community in which we rid ourselves of our old selves, the selves that participated in the old system and undergo the process of being recreated. It is the community in which our stories are transformed. In other words, there we are encountering the social other anew. There is nothing spectacular about this process of conversion within the church, more often than not. The unfortunate part is that church is not necessarily going to be terribly exciting as we engage in this lifelong process of conversion, as opposed to someone being knocked on one's ass, for example. The fortunate part is that if we perceive it as somewhat boring, we might very well be on the right track. Again, Allison writes, Mass is supposed to be boring. It's a long, and I felt much better when I read that. It's a long-term education in becoming unexcited, since only that will enable us to dwell in a quiet bliss, which doesn't abstract from our present or our surroundings or our neighbor, but which increases our attention, our presence, and our appreciation for what is around us. Church affords us the weekly or even daily opportunity to step out of a system that demands attention and strives toward excitement on matters without merit, into a community striving to attend to what is truly present, how we participate in the old system, and how we can help usher in the new. In other words, it is a practice ground for a new way of living and a new way of being in relationship. Allison cites Thomas Merton in referring to the church as our escape from, quote, a collective hypnosis. And if one experiences the risen Lord in the Eucharist in such a way that they experience the transformative apostolic witness, they, quote, can never again belong wholeheartedly to any other social or cultural or religious group. The only unity to which he or she cannot escape belonging is the new unity of humanity that the Holy Spirit creates out of the risen victim, the unity which subverts all other unities. It is an identification with a new story. Allison continues, that counter story, which no one manages to forge with absolute limpidity, is not the story of Jesus superimposed on our own, but it really is our story. It is exactly our hope in God's creative vivaciousness, which allows us not to grasp onto our story, but to allow God to create by means of us something much richer and more extraordinary than we could imagine that we are about. The first point here, then, is that although conversion is a personal process, it is essentially communal. It happens in community, in our ongoing encounter with the resurrected Lord in community, by our practice of mediating the grace of forgiveness in community, and by more generally witnessing to that grace in community. Again, a theme that Brian was discussing last evening. Now, if our stories are to be transformed, we must be able to admit that the story or stories we once identified with and with which we built our worldview were wrong. One biblical illustration Allison points to in encouraging Christians to live without fear of being wrong is the parable of the talents. The basic story is this, for all the Catholics in the room, did a great joke that never fails. A master must leave on a trip, gives his talents to 3 servants to keep while he's away. 2 invest the talents, the 3rd buries his. When the master returns, he's pleased with those who have given him the original talents and their gains, but he rebukes the 3rd for doing nothing with the talent. It's a jarring rebuke for the casual reader, as it seems the 3rd took the safe route with someone else's property while the others risked it. Allison claims that the key to understanding this parable is recognizing that it is about the imagination of the servants as to what their master is like. The old system has crafted the servants' imagination such that since their narrative forces them to think of God as being not keen on our taking risks or being wrong. To take such risks and to be found wrong leads to guilt and culpability in the old system, which in turn takes one outside the bounds of the in-group. Put differently, Allison sees that the servant who hid the master's talent was scandalized by the risks taken by his fellow servants. It is to those who have taken risks that God shows God's satisfaction, however. Rooted in the acknowledgement of the gratuity of God's loving forgiveness, especially in its explicit form in the resurrection, the innocent victim, Allison argues that the gratuity of God means that God does not just love us, but God likes us. God likes us as we are. And he argues once we relax into this being loved and liked, we are freed to participate in the recreation of our identities by taking daring leaps and acting in ways unafraid of mistakes and willing to learn from them. We cannot be the co-creators of the new system without the freed imagination to think creatively and take risks for the new system. The failure of the servant then was a failure of imagination. That is, the servant was not able to envision a master, quote, who likes us and so is delighted that we will come up with crazy, new, daring schemes, which didn't seem to be part of the program at all. The church, where the master gives us talents, is a place in which our imaginations can be reformed, where we can understand God as both loving and liking us. We can go from a belief in a God of exclusion to a God of inclusion, from a God of strict black and white rules to a God of mercy and compassion for our humanity. We can go from a belief in a God who desires us to make no waves and to maintain the status quo to a God excited for us to try out new ideas. And in the way that the church provides for the reformation of our understanding of God, God can liberate the church to reflect this new understanding of God and the new system God wills for us. In rethinking the church as an institution willing to take risks, Allison uses the beautiful image of a party Jesus invites us to, but we are surprised by those we see entering the party, folks we did not expect would be invited, maybe even some who've been offended, who we have been offended by and could be hurt that our friend would seem so callous to our concerns by inviting them. But there is something special in our being invited to this party. We are liked as well, and if we open our eyes to what is there in this capacity to see, we can see that like those we have long since decided to despise, they can also be liked as we are liked. Allison thinks the church has much to learn from our host's promiscuity, his word, evidenced in the invited attendees. The lesson is about how we deal with those we do not like and with whom we do not agree, an issue that is not just important, but Allison writes, quote, the only really important issue at hand. The reason this is of central concern is that it reflects an honest engagement with the reality of the old system. Exclusion was the old system. Now, in light of the revelation and the resurrection, we can see, quote, how we have all been wrong together, in which I too am on the side of those with whom I disagree, as someone undergoing a change of heart along with them. Allison argues that as a result of this priority of reconciliation, in light of the death and resurrection, and in light of death, the death having been conquered by Jesus, our responsibility lies in making room for others to be reconciled to God and one another. We do not hold over them any perceived rightness in contrast to their wrongness. Instead, we do not mind being perceived as wrong, ignorant, or naive. Again, this is not because in the end we are right. Rather, it is because we are in the same position as everyone else, possibly wrong, maybe even very wrong. And in the same way, we would want others to make room for us to be reconciled, recognizing our participation in the old system and turning toward the new, we too must offer that same space for others. And so the work in the church is a work of honesty, in which we gather together to be led through and to undergo the recreation of our stories such that they reflect the truth of the Gospels. Honesty, however, does not mean a claim to the truth which we wield against others, but it's a gift given to us, one toward which we may strive, but in the end are gifted. And as such, one of the disciples' principal responsibilities is to be self-critical as an individual, but also with the institution, that is, the community of the faithful. Only with this self-criticism can we be led to being recreated, again, individually and collectively. Now, in light of this, let's return briefly to the hometown conflict. The temptations are clear. In a situation in which one moves beyond the constraints they inherited in their families and hometowns, the narratives that they received, we can often desire to either disengage totally or encounter them superficially. And I will argue, in light of traumas endured, sometimes that might be the best and only option available for some. However, for those of us who are just simply pissed, our responsibilities are much deeper than that. We must allow the grace of God and the loving forgiveness of the resurrected Jesus to transform us breaking our hearts to realize what we once might have participated in and what others still do. And instead of lording over our hometown with truth, with this truth that we have that they don't yet have, we must instead be those resurrected Christs to them, mediating that loving forgiveness, that grace to them, so that they, like us, can be in that process of being remade. And as Greg mentioned in one of his answers to a question yesterday, there is indeed something about accompaniment that is required of us. We must not just acknowledge our connections to them, but we must be with those we disagree with, mediating that grace, modeling a life of unconditional love toward them in a way that communicates that we both love and like them. I'm reminded here of something that Burton says in some conversations about confronting those who are wrong. And he says that we have to be really careful in doing so because it's only going to be effective if those you're correcting believe that you love them, and you really must love them, which I think is the harder part, right? No easy task. So let me conclude with a story, if I may. Given his commitment to justice and his commitment to small town living, two realities that do not often live peacefully together, a couple of years ago, I wrote Wendell Berry a letter on this point to ask him how he holds these differing aspects of his life together. How, I asked, do you live out inclusion and advocate for justice when political polarization is so extreme and when small towns are often populated by supporters of politicians who fan those flames? My very concerns. And he wrote to me, as a Christian, you would not like a situation, he wrote it to me on a small piece of paper and in pencil, so I could adapt it to say whatever I want. As a Christian, you would not like a situation that is snooty or doctrinally exclusive, but that may only require you not to be exclusive yourself. Around here, we have all kinds, no extremes so far as I know, but don't make too much of differences. Tanya and I don't use social media or slogans. In this short passage from his only slightly longer letter, Berry made two significant points. First, he made it clear that the work the advocate does is not on others. We are not out trying to get others to change in some explicit manner of proving them wrong. Instead, our obligation is about ourselves. We must ensure that we embody the characteristics that we want in our community or neighborhood. In other words, we can only control what we can control. Start there. Second, he implied that in not using social media or slogans, he engages the deeper, longer, more nuanced and complex realities, and not the sound bites, memes, or headlines that stir up hatred between those who differ. What makes opponents the same is more important than what makes them different. This sentiment was revealed further in a New Yorker article featuring Wendell Berry, published just a few months after our correspondence. Quote, war, he suggests, begins in a failure of acceptance. He writes of exchanging friendly talk with Trump voters at Port Royal's farm supply store, a kind of tolerance that is necessary in a small town. If two neighbors know that they may seriously disagree, but that either of them, given even a small change of circumstances, may desperately need the other, should they not keep between them a sort of prepaid forgiveness? They ought to keep it ready to hand like a fire extinguisher. Without this, we risk conflagration. A society with an absurdly attenuated sense of sin starts talking then of civil war or holy war. Of course, this prepaid forgiveness that he keeps ready at hand is a hard pill to swallow for those whose existence is threatened by the potential recipients who do rely on social media and slogans. But I think Berry makes a strong case in recognizing that the only way to truly combat the violence that erupts in the world is by transforming our existence in it, especially our existence with those who are not yet ready to change. It is not our obligation to play the game in the same way. We can intentionally be a distinct presence in our community, sowing different seeds and presenting ourselves in a way that might be persuasive in our actions instead of our arguments. How? By starting with ourselves. We must continue to open ourselves to that forgiving grace and allowing ourselves to be radically revised. Not only do I see this as an option for everyone, but I do believe it to be the mandate for the Christian disciple, even if I fail more often than not. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach. Our second presentation will be given by Dr. John Edwards. Edwards is Director of Residential Ministry and Affiliate Faculty in Theology at Villanova University, where he also co-directs the MA in Ministry and Theology program. He is the author of James Allison and he's the author of James Allison and a Girardian Theology, Conversion, Theological Reflection, and Induction. which is based on his dissertation he completed here at Boston College in 2015. He has also published several articles on Allison, Girard, and mimetic theory and theological method. John's paper is entitled Ministerial Formation through Interpersonal Transformation, Putting Mimetic Theory to Ministerial Use. Welcome.
Thanks, everyone. Glad to be here. Glad to be back. Thanks for the invitations and thanks for the participation. I've enjoyed the webinars and just being able to revisit some thinking and doing it in a communal way, which has been really enjoyable and a good excuse to kind of put other things aside and revisit things that are important to me. Thanks to Zach for making a beginning of reference to kind of the ecclesial nature of conversion. My paper will take a little bit more of an ecclesial, although maybe a little bit broader than we commonly think of ecclesial sense. So for the last 10 years, my work has been focused primarily on the formation of young adults, mostly Catholic, discerning and pursuing vocations to lay ministry in various ecclesial, educational, and other nonprofit settings. I've had the privilege of doing this work both at the interpersonal level of relational accompaniment of dozens of young adults, and at the structural level of shaping and reshaping a graduate ministry and theology program and its various components. While my employment of a Girardian theology has sometimes been with explicit intention, as I reflect back over the last 10 years, I can see with a little more clarity the extent to which this Girardian theology has shaped my work in ministerial formation at both the interpersonal and the structural levels. I believe I've been putting mimetic theory to ministerial use in ways which I have not been fully aware. More than once in my previous writings, I have drawn attention to a short passage from early on in our friend James's second book, Raising Able, Recovery of Eschatological Imagination. I have made regular reference to this description of his putting mimetic theory to theological use because I believe it is helpful for understanding the relationship between mimetic theory and Christian theology. James writes, "We're going to put mimetic theory to work to see what it helps us recover from the apostolic witness. That is to say, we're putting it to theological use. To do this, we have to return to first principles and ask ourselves, what is it that makes this theory, possible in the first place?" For James, mimetic theory and Christian theological reflection have a shared origin in the disciples' experience of the crucified and risen Christ. And it is because of this shared origin that mimetic theory and Christian theology have a reciprocal capacity to clarify one another. Of course, Christian ministerial formation shares the same origin as well. So I keep putting mimetic theory to ministerial use as an extension of James's putting it to theological use. As I have thought about this passage more, I have started to see that it is also a way of saying that we shouldn't expect a Girardian theology, that is a theology informed by mimetic theory, to be radically different from strands of Christian theology with which we are already familiar, even while it brings to the fore a theological anthropology revealed through the reception of forgiveness. So too, putting mimetic theory to ministerial use doesn't generate an understanding and practice of Christian ministerial formation that is radically different from strands with which some of us may already be familiar. Instead, pursuing ministerial formation informed by mimetic theory leads us to pay more attention to the interpersonal networks and social contexts that are at play in the identity formation of those preparing for ministry, as well as those mentoring, supervising, supporting, and educating future ministers. It also helps us understand formation and transformation as integral and holistic, meaning inclusive of the relational or social, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual dimensions of our experience as people and as ministers. While for many of us, it may seem that integral and holistic are overused descriptors for any number of education and formation programs, to the point where we may even stop attending to the meaning of these words. I believe that a Girardian approach of formation and transformation works to keep the inseparable dimensions of our experience in explicit relationship with one another. And recognizing that identity formation only ever happens according to the desires or through the eyes of those others that serve as our models, a Girardian approach doesn't allow for an understanding of a self and other as discrete entities, nor for treating the various dimensions of our experience as separate parts of ourselves. Instead, by allowing our networks of relationships and our social contexts to come to the fore of our attention, an approach to ministerial formation informed by mimetic theory allows for intellectual, relational, and/or spiritual discoveries about one's own prior formation in and through others, which students can then begin to process and integrate thematically across the other dimensions of their experience. While I'm not in a place to articulate some fully elaborated Girardian approach to ministerial formation, I would like to spend the next few minutes identifying some of the particular elements of ministerial formation that I have found to be most fundamental to my work, how I see them to be informed by mimetic theory, and then to describe briefly and in a general way how I have found them to be impactful for the young adults of whom I've had the privilege of walking alongside. The first element of my approach to ministerial formation that I would like to reflect on with you is what I would describe as a particular attention and responsiveness to the social identities and the interpersonal histories of those being formed for ministry, to the extent that those individuals choose to disclose those histories and identities. From very first conversations, through the application process, orientation, and the entirety of the program, we communicate to ministers seeking formation that their particular identities, social context, and interpersonal histories matter not the program, but they also are essential to understanding and growing into the ministers that each of them are called to become. Students entering our program can choose how much of their identities and histories they want to share with one another, with one or more of their mentors at any given point, but we work toward creating a strong enough container that students feel comfortable making these contexts explicit. Our hope is that they can articulate more fully for themselves the moments of discovery or revelation that they have already experienced, while also preparing the soil for more to be unearthed. As students inhabit their own narratives more fully, the possibility of receiving forgiveness in and through their interpersonal interactions, as well as their spiritual practices, increases. A Girardian understanding of conversion highlights the particularity of our interpersonal narratives as the place within which transformation happens, through the reception of forgiveness that allows us to see more fully our entanglements and rivalry as we are finding ourselves increasingly free of them. By inhabiting our narratives more fully, we can start to see that the interpersonal and intrapersonal rivalries that we are finding ourselves leaving behind were inherited from others before we ever perpetuated them ourselves. And to some extent, they have always also had the effect of turning our understanding of the divine into our rival as well. By creating a strong enough container for students to gradually choose to name their own histories and identities, our program tries to create the conditions for interpersonal interactions among students that also generate interactions with the students' own histories in ways that have the potential to be transformative. The program's attention and sensitivity to students' social identities and interpersonal histories from the very first conversations and moving forward also allows us to be intentional in selecting for each student a set of mentoring relationships and ministerial collaborations on campus that are greatly informed by the student's context. Having spent many years building relationships and getting to know the staff and faculty within my own departments, as well as in other academic and co-curricular departments, particularly those creating safe spaces for students of various minoritized identities, our program provides ministry students with mentors and ministerial placements that have the greatest potential to support them interpersonally, while also promoting their development as ministers. In selecting specific mentors and placements, we seek to balance placing students with people and spaces that have resonances with identities and histories that our students have named as most salient and formative for themselves, and also placing them with people and spaces that overlap with interests, strengths, and areas of growth in ministry that the students have named as motivating for their own developing sense of vocational discernment. I have seen that over the course of the program, our efforts at selecting mentors and placements that intentionally balance these two aspects of the student's experience significantly increase each student's sense of agency in relationship to both their past and future selves, thereby gradually giving them greater freedom in the present to make choices about how mentors, supervisors, faculty, their own students, as well as family and friends. In addition to students' placements with ministerial mentors, our program also creates a network of support staff for each student, which includes a position supervisor, field education instructor, counselor, academic advisor, and a peer group of graduate ministry student coworkers who are at different stages in the program. These staff members provide varying kinds and degrees of interpersonal support to each student based on their skill and role. The position supervisor provides both interpersonal and organizational support to ensure that each student is balancing well their multiple ministerial and academic commitments, as well as their own needs and interests. The field education instructor focuses on the students' growing awareness of their own ministerial identity. The counselor offers psychological support for students while also helping them to navigate their roles in relationship to psychological needs of those that they are accompanying. Each person in the staff support network understands their own role and has a consistent communication with the other staff, so as to operate as a network of support rather than a collection of individual supports. This network of support staff, together with the intentionally selected ministerial mentors, create an environment of care that demonstrates in embodied and structural ways that all the dimensions of the students' identities, histories, and present experience are invited to enter into the process of formation and potential transformation that the program is helping to construct for them. I see this network of support and environment of care that it creates as a practical expression of James's unrelenting insistence that in the process of conversion that he describes as reception of forgiveness, grace always precedes ethics. His frequent use of the phrase subversion from within emphasizes that conversion and the reception of forgiveness only ever happens from where we actually are, in the full particular concreteness of our lives, with all their intersecting identities, histories, relationships, and contingencies. The transformation made possible through the reception of forgiveness never does and never can have any prerequisites of disposition or context. And no amount of effort to make oneself good or better, or to appear good in order to prepare for conversion or transformation is productive or necessary. Grace precedes ethics, and it also precedes theology. Or to use another of James's phrases, undergoing precedes understanding, and it also precedes any kind of ethical living. This means that being invited to show up as fully as possible as we are, rather than as some form of what or who we believe we should be, is also an invitation to step into our vocations as co-creators of ourselves. The varied and multi-layered network of support for students, for the most part, also allows the students to choose what parts of and how much of their identities and histories they will disclose and to whom. It allows them to choose how they will rely on each person, that they can gradually show up more and more as they are. My experience of the impact of this network on students is that much more than often than not, it increases their sense of agency in relationship to their own identities, histories, and experience. Before I reflect further on our ministerial formation program's application of mimetic theory, please allow me to describe briefly two more elements of the program which attend to theological and spiritual formation respectively. The academic requirements of the program include 4 theory and practice of ministry courses, each of which are paired with one of the students' field education courses. As one might expect from a degree program in ministry and theology, these courses are designed to encourage students to work together to keep their ministerial experiences, as well as their spiritual, contextual, and practical questions in an ongoing thematic interaction with their theological study. These courses employ a praxis model that attempts to induct students into a regular practice of moving from ministerial interpersonal experience to theological reflection and back again in a reciprocal way. As would be expected, the program includes regular spaces for shared and individual prayer and spiritual expression. While we encourage and support students in finding a spiritual mentor or guide, we provide semesterly retreat opportunities specifically for our graduate students, as well as support them in finding other retreat experiences that may better meet them where they are. These and other opportunities, as well as regular encouragement for students to continue to developing their own spiritual practices, are aimed at bringing students' attention to their experience of their relationship with God, as well as to the narrative that continue to shape that experience. The form of spaces created and the encouragement offered in relation to spiritual practice invite students to show up as they are, in their own histories and experiences of faith and spirituality as well, hopefully reinforcing their sense that their own particular relational context is the only place from which they can continue down their own vocational path. While this is only a partial and high-level description of our ministerial formation program, I hope it gives enough details for some further reflection on the anthropology of grace that correlates with James's putting mimetic theory to theological use. At its core, his anthropology centers on our free reception of forgiveness that gradually reveals to us our true relationship to ourselves, God, and others. In short, what that reception of forgiveness reveals to us is God's completely non-rivalrous love for us, our own creation as desiring imitators, and our shared creatureliness with others. We experience this revelation as a transformation of false remembering, perceiving, and imagining, through which we wrongly related to both God and others as rivals, and ourselves as innocent generators of our own desires and identities. Two key words in the summary of James's anthropology are free and gradual. Here I want to return to my experience of working with ministry students, because my relationships with them have helped me to better understand what we might mean when we call this transformation free. I better understand now than I did 10 years ago that one way of describing what we mean by when we call this transformation free is to say that grace meets us where we are, in the midst of our particular social identities, experiential histories, and relational contexts that are shaping us into the person that we are right now. As I said earlier, there can be no prerequisites of disposition or context for grace to show up and meet us. The more I have worked with students trying to intentionally pursue a ministerial vocation, the more clearly I can see that our primary work informing them is encouraging and inviting them to see and name themselves as honestly and fully as possible, because it is only within their actual present narratives about themselves, God, and others, even if those narratives are not fully true, that transformation is possible. I've had the privilege of watching students who had been trying to be where they believed I or others expected them to be, gradually become free enough to name where they actually are. And then I have watched as a presence of forgiveness that they did not know that they were seeking begins to free them and free them to show up just as they are, with their own particular strengths and limitations, and their own past and present experiences of trauma, healing, and relative freedom. Oftentimes, students come to a recognition that they have been half-knowingly trying very hard to be good or perceived as good as soon as they can name for themselves or others how hard they've been trying, they start to experience that they need not try at all. And they are, in fact, already forgiven for their trying. The reception of forgiveness, as James understands it, is free because it does not require anything of us. Again, there are no prerequisites of disposition or context. This transformation is gradual because most of the time, our habitual, half-knowing ways of trying very hard to make ourselves good take time to unlearn. And this is the case even as we are able to see through them to the truth of our identities as desiring imitators held firmly in being by the faithfulness of God's non-rivalrous love for us and for others. I have sat with students as they describe their experience of seeing themselves more clearly, while also watching themselves rehearse familiar habits of striving to be good, which demonstrate that their experience of love is unconditional and non-rivalrous is still only partial. I have seen the look on some students' faces as they receive the beginning of a freedom to be the desiring imitators that they actually are, and they realize that they can stop trying to justify their value or prove their skills as ministers. There is usually an element of dumbfounded surprise that is hesitantly joyful. Hesitant because they can't quite believe that it is actually true. I imagine that this description is one that most of us have experienced a version of ourselves. And while the look of surprise and hesitant joy is consistent through the many students that I have watched receiving it, the particular details of each person's identities, histories, and narratives are quite varied. And it has always been the case that the caring attention paid to their own particularities and specificities, both by themselves and those with whom they have chosen to disclose those stories, have been essential for the student's ability to come to a new or renewed discovery of who they are. By being allowed and encouraged to name and be where they actually are in all its particularity, and then being held with care in that place, students more often than not have an experience of being able to see themselves, God, and others more clearly. And then they can start to relate to themselves, God, and others more honestly. And yet, I'm sure that we all know that our former false ways of relating to others have a way of hanging around even after we have named them to be false. The various elements of our program that I described briefly above are aimed at supporting students in the process of integrating their new or renewed discovery into the other dimensions of their experience. It may be the case that this discovery starts to break through for a particular student intellectually, first during an insightful class discussion or if they read a theological text. And in this case, the other elements of the program are there to help them to process and receive this same discovery socially, interpersonally, spiritually, etc. Or it may be the case that this discovery begins interpersonally through a series of increasingly open conversations with a mentor who resonates with some of the student's most salient histories. And then the other elements of the program help the student to receive their discovery intellectually, spiritually, socially, and so on. By attending to the interpersonal, social, emotional dimensions of the student's experience, as well as the intellectual and spiritual dimensions, and then bringing these dimensions into regular interaction with each other, a ministerial formation program does formation by fostering the conditions to make interpersonal transformation possible. And then it helps students to begin to integrate thematically the discovery of the source of that transformation into the rest of their experience. I believe that this approach puts mimetic theory to ministerial use by returning to the first principles of the apostolic witness, in which the intelligence of death, that is, a pervasive belief that death is ultimate, is exposed and subverted by what James calls the intelligence of the victim. The apostolic witnesses' discovery of their own identities and as desiring imitators held firmly in being by the non-rivalrous love of God comes through the form of their interpersonal encounter with the crucified and risen Jesus. Yet we see throughout Acts and the epistles that integrating this discovery into their social lives and their understandings of salvation is quite a gradual and slow process. My experience of sitting with many of my students has helped me to see that it is a form of the intelligence of death and the shame that it fosters that are underneath their efforts to be good and prove their skill. They have a false sense, as most of us do, that recognition and value and the ability to contribute is limited and even scarce. And as a result, just beneath the surface, they are in various ways comparing themselves, usually not very charitably, to the ministers that they see around them. I believe that it is not fully subverted intelligence of death and the resulting shame that a ministerial formation has as its primary work, to unearth and allow to be transformed within whatever dimensions of the student's experience that it is still operative. In my experience, two elements that are helpful in supporting this transformation are creating multiple avenues for attending to the particular social identities and experiential histories of each student, and creating a multi-layered network of support which invites students to engage all the various dimensions of their experience and upholds their agency by offering varied and multiple options for them to share their identities and experiences. While these elements do not cause or ensure transformation, I have found them to be effective in encouraging students to open themselves further to the non-rivalrous love of God, who is always already there, offering forgiveness to each of us exactly as we are. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Our next presenter is John Steichen. Johnny is a doctoral candidate in systematic theology at Boston College. His interests include systematic and fundamental theology, Lonergan studies, transcendental Thomism, mimetic theory, contemplative theology, and phenomenology. His dissertation, Looking for Salvation in a Secular Age, Fundamental Theology and the Absence of God, explores the complementary contributions of transcendental Thomism and mimetic theory to fundamental theology in a secular age. His paper is titled, What Has Transcendental Thomism to Do with Mimetic Theory? Continuing the Lonergan-Girard conversation. Welcome, John.
Somebody missing their glasses? No? Okay. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for being here today. Thank you, Carlos, for organizing the event. Thank you, Francis, for asking me to participate, for tracking me down. Thank you, Maddie, for moderating, Zach, for leading this, John, for your paper. And thank you, James, for joining us here this week. I know we're all very grateful for your attention and time. Today, I'd like to present in outline form, the idea for one of the arguments I hope to make in a part of my yet-to-be written dissertation. The parts yet to be written. Generally stated, my claim goes something like this. The question of God is implicit in all human questioning as a question of transcendent being and goodness. The question of God as a question of salvation is also implicit in human questioning, if not all, perhaps not in all human questioning, precisely because because the question of God as a question of salvation, even when it remains implicit, is a modification or manifestation of the question of God as a question of transcendence, but under the conditions of sin. The way I will try to argue for this today will be somewhat indirect. First, to give some context for the argument, I will introduce the question of the dissertation and present some of the reasons why I want to bring Lonergan-Girard, or as Maddie said, Lonergan-Girard, would be nice, into conversation. Yeah. Then I will attempt to use some of the resources of Lonergan's thought to defend Girard against the common criticism of his work, which is that his understanding of mimetic desire, the scapegoat mechanism, and ritual sacrifice imply an ontology of original violence and are therefore incompatible with with Catholic doctrine and Judeo-Christian metaphysics of creation. I do this not because I think Girard lacks the resources to make the defense on his own, but because I think that bringing Lonergan into conversation with Girard on this point will both strengthen Girard's defense and, importantly, lead to interesting conclusions or questions about the nature of the question of God as a question of salvation, which is what I would like to talk about. So to give some context to the argument, I'll briefly summarize the question of my dissertation. So in the dissertation, I'm responding to at least two things. First, I'm responding to what I call a bias against properly religious questions in our contemporary secular culture. And second, I'm responding to Grant Kaplan's suggestion that fundamental theologians use Girard's work as a resource for carrying out their task. Regarding the first point, I claim that we do in fact live in a secular culture, in Charles Taylor's sense of that term, and that in this culture, there are many corners that harbor biases against what I would call properly religious questions or questions of transcendence and salvation. By a bias against religious questions, I mean at least two things. First, I mean that there is in our culture a tendency to ignore or shut down properly religious questions before they can be genuinely engaged. Although this happens for more reasons than I can account for, it often occurs on account of a felt sense that religion is a cover story for a particular political agenda, that it is an ideology, in other words, or on account of a felt sense that because religious institutions are often corrupt, the very business of religion itself is corrupt, and so its questions are not to be entertained or engaged. Second, I mean that even when such questions are directly raised and engaged, there is a tendency in our culture to assume, and indeed to feel, that they do not admit of intelligent and reasonable answers. For the answer to such questions have, as a matter of historical circumstance, been banished to the realm of mere opinion. The causes of this exile are, again, too numerous to detail, but I can offer at least two that I think are significant. First, we live in a culture, a scientific culture, in which objectivity is felt to be the exclusive possession of mathematics and the empirical sciences or the natural sciences. And second, our growing awareness of pluralism in general and religious pluralism in particular leads some to feel that there cannot be one right answer to religious questions. In short, relativism is the word, at least once we venture beyond the empirical sciences. The problem we face then, as I understand it, or one of the many problems we face, is that we suffer not from an open and explicit opposition to religious questions as such, but rather from a tendency to shut them down before they are directly and adequately engaged on their own terms, and this on account of a distorted value horizon that feels that religion is an issue of partisan politics, morally compromised, oppressive and hypocritical, or basically irrational. The consequence of this is that we often fail to raise fundamental questions about human existence, and even when we do raise them, our engagement of them can be hampered as we tend either to deny they can be discussed or answered rationally, let alone, or we resist recognizing that such questions do ultimately lead to, and even are perhaps the same as, the so-called properly religious questions I keep mentioning. If efforts at religious education and evangelization are to stand any chance of being successful, at least in our context, and those of you who teach at Boston College or anywhere probably know what I mean, there is a need to articulate how Christianity is engaging and responding to the most existentially urgent and in fact inevitable questions of human existence. But this cannot be done unless the questions themselves are first identified accurately, articulated clearly, and ultimately communicated effectively. For unless this occurs, we will continue to find ourselves faced with what Johann Baptist Metz describes as one of the church's greatest embarrassments in the contemporary world, namely, and this is a quote, the problem of how and in what manner should faith in the church give an answer to the world when this world no longer seems to have any questions about the church and about the faith she offers for consideration. This need is, in my estimation, one that is to be met in part by fundamental theology. The type of fundamental theology I have in mind traces its roots back to Maurice Blondel in his philosophical apologetics and embraces the turn to the subject as a way of raising religious questions or questions about transcendence and the supernatural in a context that is predisposed against them. While I cannot argue for this here, I take Bernard Lonergan's method in theology, and specifically what he calls foundations, to be a genuine inheritor and innovator of this approach. Lonergan's is the version of the approach that serves as the method for the dissertation, which has as its goal the identification and articulation of the fundamental forms or ground forms, if you will, of the question of God, as well as the demonstration of how these questions are implicit in the unfolding of human consciousness itself, at least in inquiry. That's the first thing I'm responding to. The second thing is Grant Kaplan's recent suggestion that fundamental theologians turn to Girard as a resource. For although the dissertation takes Lonergan's method as its point of departure, I am primarily interested in the possible contribution Girard may make to the work of foundations, and especially to the task of identifying and articulating the way the question of God as a question of salvation is implicit in the concrete unfolding of human consciousness in community. I've chosen Girard for several reasons. First, Girard's thought, I think, is compatible with Lonergan's method, both because it embraces the anthropological turn and because Girard's anthropology is one of conversion, which means he is already, at least in some sense, engaged in the work of foundations, in Lonergan's sense of that term. Second, Girard embraces the turn into the subject or the anthropological turn in a way that both enables him to speak at the level of our time or to dialogue with contemporary culture, while also avoiding reduction to the horizon of contemporary secular culture, since the horizon within which he derives his basic terms and relations is directly dependent on Judeo-Christian revelation. The dissertation then offers an account of the contributions Girard and Mimetic theory may make to fundamental or foundational theology, and specifically to raising the question of God as a question of salvation, while also noting the limitations of this contribution, many of which, if not most of which, I think can be overcome if certain aspects of Girard's anthropology are situated within Lonergan's explanatory account of the subject. So, one of the tasks the dissertation aims to accomplish then by bringing Lonergan and Girard together is to establish that the question of salvation is in fact implied in the concrete unfolding of human consciousness under the conditions of sin, even if it's not explicitly raised as such. And moreover, I aim to show that this question of salvation is none other than the question of God that is implied in the transcendental orientation of all human consciousness towards transcendent being and goodness. So, the thesis that the argument that I'm going to try to make aims to support is something like this. Not only is the question of God a question of transcendence, not only is the question of God as a question of transcendence implicit in the transcendental structure of human consciousness, but so too is the question of God as a question of salvation. This is the case because the question of salvation is a manifestation of the question of God as a question of transcendence, but under the conditions of sin. My first claim then is that the question of God is a question of transcendence, My first claim then is that the question of God as a question of transcendence is implicit in all human inquiry and rises explicitly when one questions questioning itself. To say that a question is implicit is to say that it hasn't occurred yet. Well, why then aren't all questions implicit? To say a question is implicit in consciousness is not simply to say that it hasn't occurred yet, but it is also to say that both the exigency for the question and the data in response to which the question may arise explicitly are already given in consciousness itself whenever one is in fact inquiring about anything. The exigency in this case is the spontaneous desire to know, which is in principle unrestricted, and so can ask about anything, including itself in its own questions. The data to be questioned include the process of inquiry in which one is engaged. One may render the question of God explicit if one questions one's own questioning and follows that questioning to its end. To give an example, questions for intelligence, why, how, does that work, those kinds of questions, anticipate or seek the intelligibility of being or some being. Because my desire to know is unrestricted, I can ask about anything, including my own asking, which is given to me whenever I am in fact inquiring or asking about anything, even if I don't advert to that fact. If I do advert to my own inquiry and ask about it, well, what am I asking about? If I'm asking questions for intelligence, when I ask these kinds of questions about my own asking, I am seeking to grasp the intelligibility of my own seeking to grasp the intelligibility of being. To put this in question form, what is the intelligibility of my attempt to grasp the intelligibility of being? Or, under what conditions is my seeking the intelligibility of being intelligible? If pursued, this line of questioning may lead to the insight that my seeking the intelligibility of being by asking questions is intelligible only under the condition that being itself is intelligible. This raises a further question. Under what conditions would being itself be intelligible? What, in other words, is the condition of the possibility of the complete intelligibility of being, which includes my very own, and contingent, I might add, inquiry into being? I think that is one way to raise the question of God. Now, of course, not everyone's going to ask the question like this. Most people don't. But it is, I think, a ground form of the question, or a transcendental form, as it will, of the question of God as it arises as a question of intelligence. Existentially, it is perhaps, or almost certainly, more recognizably articulated as the question, does my life make any sense? Or do I make sense? Which I think we all ask at some point. For to ask about the sense of one's own life or existence is to seek to know its intelligibility, which of course includes the intelligibility of one's desire to understand and to understand one's own life. I don't have the time or space to say more about this except to say that following Lonergan, I think that this question of God, which is the question that arises when questioning itself, may be raised in at least three fundamental ways. There's a fourth one. It's the one that has to do with grace. And because I'm on a panel talking about grace, it's the one I'm not going to mention. So first, we can inquire about our own inquiring, and so raise the question of God as a question of the intelligibility of being. Second, we can reflect on our own reflecting and raise the question of God as a question of the transcendent and necessary ground of being. And third, we can deliberate about our own deliberating. I've never said deliberating like deliberating until today. And so we can raise the question of God as a question of the goodness of that transcendent ground of being. My claim then is that the question of God as a question of salvation, which is not immediately identifiable as any of the three questions I just mentioned, nor necessarily as the fourth one I'm not mentioning, though they're related. My claim is that the question of God as a question of salvation is, under the conditions of sin, a particular manifestation of the question of God as a question of transcendence. To show why I think this is the case, I'm now going to turn to Girard. And because I have not, in all honesty, figured out completely how I want to argue for this, my attempt to do so will be a little indirect, but I hope the point comes through. And I'm going to take a common criticism of Girard's work as my starting point. So, the basics of the critique I have in mind are, I presume, familiar to most of us here, so I will simply summarize them. In short, and perhaps too simply put, I won't attribute this version of the critique to anybody in particular. Maybe it goes something like this. On Girard's account, desire is mimetic. As such, it inevitably leads to conflict and violence. Conflict and violence, in their turn, give rise to the scapegoat mechanism, which is inherently unjust. Finally, the scapegoat mechanism sets the conditions for the emergence not only of human culture, but also of human beings properly understood since it enables hominization. It's part of the hominization thesis. In short, the claim goes, because mimetic desire is supposed inevitably to lead to violence, this is taken to imply that it is in fact ordered to violence. The implication would be then that it is evil or not good, as is everything that follows or rests upon it, including human nature. And this is taken to be at odds with the Judeo-Christian metaphysics in general and Catholic doctrine specifically. To be clear, I don't think the criticism holds. And there are, of course, a number of ways of responding to it. The first would be exegetical. One could turn to Girard's text and ask, does he in fact say this? Joel Hodge has done an admirable job of this and showing that not only does Girard explicitly deny that human desire is fundamentally evil, but also that this claim is not simply an unjustified and retroactive attempt to evade criticism, appealing to Girard's distinction between vertical and deviated transcendency and deceit desire in the novel. Hodge argues that Girard's Anthropology has the resources to support a claim about the original goodness of desire. I think it's true. A second way to respond to the criticism would be to move past the merely exegetical question. Desire is in fact mimetic, and that it does, at least sometimes, and perhaps often, lead to the scapegoat mechanism. Is there a way to verify that such desire is nevertheless originally good? I think that if mimetic desire is contextualized within the context of a more complete explanatory anthropology than Girard perhaps offers himself, but one that is also compatible with his basic claims, and especially compatible with this claim about deviated and vertical transcendency, one can in fact show this quite convincingly, that it is originally good desire. This is what Transcendental Thomism and has to do with mimetic theory. So through intentionality analysis, I think that one can show that mimetic desire has, as the condition of its possibility, an original orientation towards transcendent goodness, such that even the scapegoat mechanism and the ritual sacrifice that follow from it, or the institutionalization of it, can be shown to be but deviated expressions of a basic and in fact ultimately ineradicable desire for the good. And I also think this is in fundamental agreement with some of Girard's claims. To give but one piece of evidence for this, which is probably not enough, I think it is true that although the scapegoat mechanism is violent and unjust, and although the ritual sacrifice institutionalizes and so perpetuates that very violence, which it is aiming to mitigate and control, it nevertheless aims at a good, or at least the apparent good. For on Girard's account, it is the perpetuation of the scapegoat mechanism in ritual sacrifice that is chosen for the sake of controlling the violence that threatens to destroy the community and its members. Its aim, or end in other words, is peace, even if that peace is temporary and achieved only by perpetuating the very violence in a controlled way that threatens the community. I suspect that an adequate justification of this claim will depend on whether or not I can convincingly reconcile Lonergan's account of transcendental desire and Girard's account of mimetic desire, though I can't do that today. My plan for doing this, open to feedback, is to claim that although desires for particular objects and even the metaphysical desire for the being of another are in fact specified in every case by mimesis, so although every particular desire is specified by mimesis, such specification has as the condition of its possibility a transcendental orientation of desire to the intelligible, the true, and the good, or to being, which itself is not strictly speaking mimetic. This is a claim that I think can be verified through intentionality analysis and maybe is not unprecedented and perhaps is compatible with what Girard himself says. At this point, and as I come to the end of my time, you may still be asking yourself, what does this attempted synthesis of Girard and Lonergan, or this attempt to articulate the dynamics of mimetic desire and the scapegoat mechanism within Lonergan's anthropology, what does that have to do with the question of God as a question of salvation? To the original question about raising the question that I raised, about raising the question of salvation as a question of transcendence or vice versa. On Girard's terms, I think you can show that the very activity of the scapegoat mechanism manifests an implicit, dare I say, awareness, maybe not, definitely not knowledge, but at least implicitly manifests that there is a need to be saved. Saved, of course, from the threat of the imminent destruction of the community and its members by the mimetic contagion of violence, but also, and more importantly, saved from the very scapegoat mechanism itself. As I mentioned, the mechanism itself is an attempt to bring about, by human means, a reprieve from violence and conflict. The problem is that it only appears to do this. For the mechanism itself is based on a lie which justifies the violence against the victim, and so brings about peace only by perpetuating the violence it is trying to control. As Henri de Lubac writes, "It is not true, as is often said, that man cannot organize the world without God. What is true is that if he does so, he can only organize it against himself." This, of course, is what we need to be saved from. In our attempt to manage our own sinful condition, we perpetuate the very thing we are trying to rid ourselves of. Implicit in this activity is, I think, a desire for, a quest for, a salvation which we cannot give ourselves. And this brings me to my final point. If I can show by bringing Girard and Lonergan together that even the scapegoat mechanism has as the condition of its possibility a transcendental orientation to the good, then I think I can show that the question of God as a question of salvation, which is implicit in the scapegoat mechanism, is in fact a manifestation of our transcendental orientation towards transcendence. And so really at bottom, a question of God as a question of transcendence, because it has the same root in consciousness as the ground form does the question. So perhaps at this point, I can simply state some of the claims that are in my argument at this point, even if not in the order they should be in. The question of God is a question. So first, the question of God as a question of transcendence is implicit in all human questioning, which questioning always has its origin in our transcendental orientation towards the intelligible, the true, and the good. 2, even the concrete desires and questions that lead people to embrace and perpetuate the scapegoat mechanism are manifestations of this transcendental orientation. 3, if deviated. 3, implicit in the scapegoat mechanism and ritual sacrifice, then, is an implicit orientation towards the good. 4, the scapegoat mechanism manifests its desire for or an implicit question and quest for salvation, which we cannot give ourselves. 5, that implicit desire or question of salvation is a manifestation of our transcendental orientation in such a way that it can be shown to imply a question of God as a question of transcendence, in a way that I think is similar to the example I gave with intelligence earlier, but probably would be most fittingly described in terms of the question of God as a question of transcendent goodness. To conclude, I want to state what I think is the central task I must complete in order to bring this argument to maturity, as well as note some of the potential difficulties that may arise in doing so. I think that the most involved part of the argument will be reconciling Girard and Lonergan on the question of desire. In attempting to do this, I foresee not only convergence on a number of things, but also divergence, which will call for dialectic. For although both have a place, as it were, for the other in their anthropology, meaning the other thinker, and although they share much in their understanding of conversion, there are foundational issues on which they may not converge. One point of conflict that I foresee will be between what each thinker suggests is the condition of the possibility of the emergence of a notion of the divine into history. As far as I understand it, for Girard, and I admit I may be wrong here, I have more reading to do, the deification of victims is part of the process of hominization. This implies that before this occurs, human consciousness is not properly human, and therefore, perhaps, does not have a transcendental orientation towards God. The claim that I want to make, and I've tried to suggest today, depends on the results of intentionality analysis, which show, I think, that for any particular idea of God or divinity to emerge, there must already be enshrined in human consciousness a place for the divine, which is, I take it, that orientation towards transcendence I keep mentioning. This is to say, on Lonergan's account, it seems that in order for there to be deified victims, consciousness must already be oriented towards the divine. While for Girard, and again, I'm not sure if I'm right about this, it seems the claims about harmonization would suggest the opposite. This brings me to a question I have about Girard's work. I find most of it utterly convincing. I do not know, though, if the claims about harmonization are verifiable or true. And so my questions for you all are, two, what do you think of this idea? And how can I make it better? Am I right? Am I wrong? Second, am I right to anticipate this incompatibility or challenge? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Johnny. Okay, so we've had three very wonderful and stimulating papers. I think now we'll open it up for some conversation, some time for some questions. But first, we'll hear from some brief comments from James Ellis.
Good morning. And once again, thank you very much indeed for having me. And thank you very much indeed for honoring me by allowing me to participate with you in this discussion. Zach, you have filled me with shame, and I hope a good sense, I hope in a sense leading to conversion, by exposing so well what I said and showing me how little I have lived into it over the many years since I said it. So thank you for that, and thank you for the reminder of what a hell of a long way I have to go in living into this myself. As you say, this is difficult. I also particularly like to thank you for the way in which you've obviously taken things from which I noticed some of the texts you quoted, which were quite specifically to do with LGBT-related issues, and applied them in a completely different field. And I'm really always thrilled when that happens, because that means that we're talking about something that is fundamental to being human, really, irrespective of which of the various, as you say, minority issues. So I was really, really pleased with that. So thank you very much indeed. And just to confirm your reading of the parable of the talents, since writing that, I was able to study my favorite crazy exegete, Duncan Jarrett, now alas dead, but I mean, he died in his 90s. And his reading of it brings out something which I hadn't realized before, which is because he was an expert, because Jarrett was an expert in literally Middle Eastern law and economy, the sort of relationship that is proposed by the owner to the servants is one of partnership. It actually presupposes the person concerned becoming the equal of the agent. So there's a kind of agency that presupposes partnership. So they were actually being invited to be, as it were, the imagination of that. And that the failure of imagination is of someone who's, in a sense, refusing to imagine that this person is capable of offering them agency as an equal. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think it was rather beautiful to have discovered that somebody who was looking at literally ancient Middle Eastern legal things discovered that. And John, well, again, what can I say? As someone who would be an absolutely hopeless interpersonal socializer myself, learning how you have interpersonally socialized mimetic theory in a way of creating the space for others to discover their giftedness. That seems to me to be a wonderful piece of work of the Holy Spirit, because I take it that that's really what any formation in ministry must be. And I kept on thinking as I was listening to this, my God, if only seminaries could be like as you described, simply with the notion of people being cared for as they are and being nudged into losing their various forms of goodness, and so becoming more able to be vulnerable as ministers and so on. Fantastic. And so I really want to congratulate you on that. I'm thrilled to have been part of that in deep background. The question I had is, what have been the biggest obstacle? If what is it that gets in the way sometimes? And if so, how do you solve that, or have you found to solve that, or have there been ones that can't be solved? I don't know. I just asked out of genuine interest. And John, thank you very much for this. I think it would be wonderful to have a long discussion on this. I don't know whether you're aware of Scott Cowdell's recent book dealing with the question of Girard and ontological violence, but it's looking at the same issue that you've been.
What is it?
Is it called Girard and ontological violence?
Yes. I think it specifically mentions Milbank.
Yes, it's because Milbank was the first person who made the critique. So he's dealing with Milbank, but other people who've said similar things. If I can make what I hope is a useful way of describing the difficulty, because I think you bring it exactly right. I think that the question is, how do we relate to the fundamental goodness of being human as God's project from the beginning, with the evidence that wherever there have been humans since the beginning of humanization, whether you go with Girard or not, we have been, excuse me, as I say, murderously dangerous to each other. More dangerous to each other than any of the other animals or germs that surround us. And that we are more dangerous to each other than other animals are to each other. The way I think that the way the Bible does this is by referring to the lamb slain from the foundation of the world, which gives the notion of God already dealing with this as part of the notion of creation at the beginning, therefore forgiveness being built into creation from the beginning. And of course, both the phrase "before the foundation of the world" is not a chronological reference; it's a celestial reference, meaning perpetually, so constantly, contemporaneously present as regards from a human point of view. But therefore, the way of considering the scapegoat mechanism and our mimetic involvement on it is to see this as an addiction to a shortcut. It's a shortcut to being human, but it's once one's in it, it's an addictive shortcut. And of course, you can only perceive that it's an addictive shortcut when you're let out of it. You say, "Oh, I can see that who you were," retrospectively, which is the point of my joy of being wrong thing, is the retrospective vision. Oh my God, we were locked in a shortcut version of ourselves, which we needn't have been from the beginning, but have been. If you want more evidence, because as you rightly say, this is a purely hypothetical argument from Girard's point of view, and the state of primatology at the time that Girard studied these things was nothing like as advanced as it is now. But there's a very, very good and very interesting, relatively recent book by a primatologist from across the river called Wrangham, called The Goodness Paradox. I don't know whether you've... Oh, I strongly recommend it. It's a fantastic account of the difference between chimps and bonobos owing to the self-domestication process in which bonobos, who are from the same, we and chimps and the bonobos are grosso modo from the same things, though whatever we are split off before the chimps and the bonobos split off. And it's all got to do with curves in the Congo River. They're splitting off from each other to do with curves in the Congo River. But it's an extraordinary study of the self-domestication process within apes, of which we show so many signs. I mean, we are, if you like, the first self-domesticated. And of course, he knows nothing of Girard. And yet, he does indicate that the real difference that is made in self-domestication is when apes stop having immediate needs to confront each other over every slight and become able to combine their affrontedness outside. Well, he doesn't say that sounds awfully like the scapegoat mechanism because he's not interested in that terminology. But the moment you see it, you can see that he's saying something really very similar to what Girard is saying as part of a self-education process. Chris Hawes, who some of you know, is a professor at Scranton, who works very much, is a theologian at Scranton who works on Girard's thought, actually, having read the book, then conducted an interview with Wrangham, which was a complete surprise to Wrangham about this. But both Wrangham's book and Chris Hawes' interview with him, I very strongly recommend as useful tools for rethinking. As I say, what sort of shortcut have we got ourselves trapped into? Sorry. Thank you very much.
Now I'll open it up for questions.
Wait, since I said so much yesterday. I want to just follow up on this last bit of discussion. And I'd actually like to ask John to weigh in. Edwards. I'm sorry, both Johns actually. John, you're John. We used to call him Johnny John. John, you wrote an article, I think it was published in Horizons like 12 years ago, working with Bronner and Girard, and maybe James as well, on the question of desire, mimetic desire. We're making, as I recall, not an unsimilar argument, sort of advancing the line that Johnny is advancing, with specific reference to Lonergan, Lonergan and Bronner's proximity to each other, without it being redundant. I wonder if you have anything to say about that. I also wanted to ask James to in your own formation, thinking of Herbert McCabe and your own formation and a certain approach to Thomism and the theology of grace, creation, protology, eschatology. When you make in The Joy of Being Wrong, you talk about the order of discovery and the order of logic. And the order of discovery, in terms of what you just articulated here, retrospectively becoming aware of what it is that we're being freed from, so as to become more capable of articulating, in fact, how it must have been or how it should be. So there's yours is a more genetic, I could put it that way, a more genetic theology of this. So to Girard, but having come to that discovery opens up the possibility of more transcendent kinds of reflection. There may be something to do with the this distinction, order of logic or order of discovery, which you of course borrow from from others before. Anyway, maybe just first I'd like to hear John weigh in a little bit on this, and see what you thought of his presentation here.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, I do think that to think about desire as both transcendent and mimetic, that we're not that there isn't any obstacle. I think I started move towards both an outer one and another, thinking about desire in a transcendental sense and using words like fundamental orientation or fundamental belonging to distinguish between like the act of desiring, right? In other words, particular desires, to show that there has to be, and similar. I mean, it's not much Lonergan is doing. There has to be an openness to the fundamental orientation outward, for there to be desire, any particular desires at all, right? And so the fundamental desiring is the condition for the possibility of there being any mimetic, any mimesis whatsoever. There has to be the orientation for there to be any ability to be formed by the other.
Yeah, I wonder if you had some thoughts about the.
May I? Yes, I forgot. You said so much to Johnny. Yeah, my question about the fundamental category is the other, because the description of the transcendental, please excuse my relation to it does sound as though everything is a deduction from the ego, starting from the thinking self, and then the conditions possibility of being able to discern all of that. Whereas what I picked up from Girard, like this is obviously through literature, not through literature and psychology, not through philosophy, formally speaking. The other is prior to the self. And that for me has been like absolutely fundamental. The condition of possibility of me having any ideas about transcendence are me having been brought into being by what is other than me at every social level. And therefore, that the implicit marker for God being much more properly the other than the I, because the I is so much more a dependent reality. And that starting from the most dependent of the realities is not necessarily the richest place to start in terms of working out what is transcendent. So that, if you like, seems to me to be a significant, as far as I can understand, both Brown and Lonergan in far that the I is fundamental still. Is that true? Or is that
Perhaps I think I may have presented it in a way that sounded like that, but especially in Lonergan's later work, he'll talk about two, what he calls vectors of development, or two ways human beings just develop, which he calls one that's like bottom up, which is through your own experience, understanding, judgment, deciding, and so on. And then the other one, which is, he says, primary, is the top down, which is love first affecting the community and eliciting any of those desires to not directly. So I actually do think the sort of he holds in the end for the absolute priority of love in generating all of that, and and is maybe more concrete than I'm making them sound, would agree, in fact, that we are primary. We truly always receive ourselves from others first and foremost. So I actually do think, and that's the one way the question of God arises that I didn't mention today, is that. And in fact, someone yesterday mentioned Pascal's quote in The Voice of Christ, which said, "You would not be seeking me had I not first found you." And that's something that Lonergan, in some of his later writings, returns to again and again, and thinks is deeply true. So the gift of God's grace, and also the love of our families and our communities are prior to all of that. So I do think that they are particularly compatible in that way, but really emphasizing that.
Thanks. Yeah, I really enjoyed the conversation. I just maybe say something that would be helpful on this particular point. I mean, I think, Lonergan does think, right, the we is prior, like if the we is prior to the I, the I has to be, discovered. But, and so, and I think that an interesting point of contact that I was thinking about as you were articulating your kind of hypothesis here, John, is really put a Lonergan on conversation, right? That our questions, like, we're not just transcendental egos when questions occur, we're actually in conversations, and the authenticity of the conversation is really the historical condition of the possibility of getting things right. Like we're learning the questions that we ask, that's also mimetic, right? Which you can see in the department. All the grad students have similar questions. They're all talking to each other. And they're learning from each other, like what things are interesting to ask about, or what kinds of questions can be asked. So it's only like a second kind of process to move back from that conversational world to the question about why is it that I'm this kind of being, that in these conversations, these questions keep arising for me, and I feel like they have some kind of claim on my attention that I can't really escape. But in a sense, the distortion of the conversation is also prior, right? Like you find yourself as a questioner because you're already in this conversation where these questions are being raised and arising for you, and only then kind of flexing to yourself will discover how perplexing you are to yourself and how perplexing actually the dysfunctionality of the conversation also is. And like moving back to the discovery of my own possibilities for being radically unauthentic, and trying to clarify for myself what it would really mean to be in a conversation in a different kind of way. Or like I'm trying to get things right instead of just showing that I am right. I love the truth more than I love possessing the truth. As if it's anyway. So I think there's something there that's really important, and just to end with this one last observation, right? Like that really gets baked into. I mean, it's baked into the structure of the discussion of the social context of knowing that comes up in 6 and 7 of insight, but also the whole architecture of method and theology. Basically to say, what is theology except for like a historical, ongoing, collaborative conversation that we can do better if we become clearer about the conditions of the possibility of actually having this conversation together.
Thank you so much. I have a question for James, and also invite John and Johnny to weigh on this as well. You use the language of we're addicted to the shortcut. My dissertation project is the theological addiction, and I'm engaging on the question about transcendental desire. The way that you use the language of addiction, and I think deriving from the anthropological approach, is that it seems to be a hangover from evolution, something that we're still caught in. We're still addicted to this process that started very early on in our socialization process. Just wondering if you have any thoughts on that, if that's how you see it. Is this term addiction is something that you're just sort of using as a shortcut phrase to describe what's happening? And then also just thoughts on the relationship between the implicitly, I think, also mimetic aspect of addiction as a phenomenon, but also the relationship between that and transcendental desire. In from a Lonergan or a Lonergan perspective.
Thank you. I'm using it in a sense, following from Girard. The first thing we learn to do is to it's the ritualistic continuing to do the same thing in the hopes that something will turn up. And really getting very distraught indeed if somebody breaks the breaks the repetition. So when I talk about shortcut, it's much established by what would be nice to check their mind. So I think that has something in common with ritualistic way to stuff. That's thinking about the old fashioned. There's also something to do with the definition of original sin, which is described as a certain being locked. Now, it's not simply we're badly formed, but there's a certain lockdown that we were in. We couldn't actually get rid of ourselves. So it's having got ourselves locked into a shortcut. So those are the two elements I was trying to talk about.
Yeah, wondering about how we and the dominant space, and also the possibility for the well, and how that actually works.
One thought I had was that the shortcut is, in a certain sense, like how desire gets deviated. And I think that talk about, sort of go back to something Zach said, like it's the easier thing, it feels like, to do the shortcut. And so yeah, I just think it's sort of like a misfire or a restriction or sort of contraction of our consciousness, which has an orientation which we don't think we follow. And we get stuck in it. So I think, yeah, that sort of orientation is what I call transcendental desire, but we only know about that because there are particular desires that do a better or worse job of actually getting it in that direction. And it seems like the deviation, the addiction, is the shortcut. Well, yeah, that's just kind of a manifestation. And, you know, we sort of repeat that kind of thing over and over again, thinking we're going to get ourselves out of it. At least that's my experience. Until you realize, almost always on account of the help of another, that if you keep doing this, it won't work. And you might have realized that 100 times ago. You'll still try to do it that way again, even once you know that it won't work. And that's maybe that experience of not being stuck with some sort of, I don't know if that's a clear answer at all, but.
Can I just ask a follow-up?
Yeah.
And I'm not on the, I should. Wondering how the types.
He begins to. I think there's a whole part in Method and Theology on feelings and different types of feelings, which is indebted to von Hildebrand and Shaler. And then Patrick Byrne wrote a book called Ethics of Discernment, which took that as a starting point and attempted to give an even more differentiated and accurate account of the various types of feelings, desires, moods that we in fact have. So there is like literature based on his thought that goes in that direction.
Thank you all so much. I have a question for Zach. Or maybe he said no. Found that opening section of the paper moving with the conflicting senses. On the one hand, these are people who do have these deeply good moral intuitions. And on the other hand, there is this like bigotry. And you post conversion as a response, or at least of what should norm our response to such conditions, and conversion happening in the church, or having an ecclesial context. One question that sort of emerges, or potential problem that I might see, is we've got a lot of people who are converted in a certain sense, right, in church context. But there's also a lot of people in church contexts who, even if spiritually converted, may not be morally or affectively converted. And I wondered, maybe this is the question, could we speak of conversion having different senses? Or could we differentiate different kinds of conversion? And I know Lonergan does this in a few different ways, such that it's possible for someone to be intellectually converted but not morally, or morally converted but not spiritually converted, or even spiritually converted but not affectively or psychically converted. And I wonder if you were to differentiate conversion in that way, would it help you with some of those hard cases where someone, maybe is functionally, like you ask them, what do you think about the Trinity? They're a modalist, right? But nonetheless, they're more spiritually converted than all of us, right? They're praying all the time. But anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think the observation is absolutely correct that, to write about conversion in this context is writing about the people that you sit in the pews with currently, right, and those who don't sit in pews necessarily, as well as a whole slew of people who are very faithful, very spiritual people, go to church, on Wednesdays and Sundays and all of that. So differentiating conversion, when I was writing this dissertation, I was sort of concerned in two spheres with the moral and intellectual conversion components. But I was also really taken by and think there's more to think about with regard to psychic conversion. And given that the role that narrative plays in the human construction of identity and worldviews and things like that, and given that narrative is bound up in symbols and language and images and things, that it's really it's almost like this becomes a practice of storytelling in another way, right? So that you're helping others, or you're facilitating the change of the types of symbols and things that the filter is willing to allow through that wouldn't have been permitted in earlier constructions of their symbolic knowledge or whatever, symbolic awareness. So yes, I think that it is a subset. And then you hope that then the wave takes it through the other categories as well. All the while conscious of the fact that the anthropology and grace, it's grace piece, conscious of the fact that you really have no control over the damn thing anyway. So, you're doing the best you can to revise the images that we swim in. And I think that's why, we think about racial resentment or negative partisanship, right? Those are, I'll give you an example. Here's a real world example. My mother-in-law was in town watching my children, and they drove downtown, and at some point in that conversation, she said, we can't give money to people on the street because they will use that to smoke. Okay? Now, my daughter is 6, and she doesn't really know exactly what smoking is, but one day she and I were driving, this was months after, and she says, oh, we can't give money to people on the street because because they smoke. And I said, who taught you that? He told me to for that. And I said, well, I'm sorry that she told you that because that's not true, right? No, that's not how, people need money, people need food, people need lots of other things. So we don't think like that. So we had a bit of a reckoning with the truth. Just a few weeks ago, my wife tells me, I was on my way to school. Ruthie brought up people on the street and smoking, and she says we can't give them money. So that it's just so deep, and it's one articulation of that, and it's in there, and we can't even extract it very easily, right? So, we need a lot more help in the stories that we can talk.
There's maybe a way we can relate what Zach just said about the psychic conversion and the transformation symbols. Taking this question about the relationship between desires and transcendental desire. Lonergan does say that symbols are images that evoke feelings or are evoked by feelings. And those associations between particular kinds of feelings or desires and particular symbols get deeply ingrained early, and they're very, very hard to change. And perhaps that's one of the ways that we could even begin to talk about why there's such a tendency for repetition. Conversion seems to me to be one of the slowest and longest to allow to happen, just because of how ingrained those things get.
Even Lonergan skipped off, right?
What?
Even Lonergan skipped off, right?
Yeah, right.
We have a few minutes ahead, but I would like just to add a comment connecting with the last panel is about political theology and theory, because I would like to call a little bit the last Girard in Angelique Clausewitz on the English title is right? Because he was talking to Van Rachan, discussing about rationality and criticizing Hegel. Girard said that, Hegel pretended that everything was rational. And he replied in a very clear way, rationality is not the last source of reality. Reality is sacrificial. So it's a very important claim in order to probably reshape our understanding of intelligibility. And I want to connect this from
from Girard to Levinas. When he was describing his ontology, he used to say that he wanted to think the being, but the being dying, not an abstract idea of being. So I would say how mimetic theory in some way allowed us in this last year to understand better, like the other side of history, the dark side of history, as the Colonial thing talk about. So all those who are starving or those who are invisible in society, and what kind of transcendental self or we could we also improve in order to understand not rationality, not selfish or narrative about who am I, but what about the others who are invisible? And what kind of political theology could be raised from that perspective? And then also, perhaps, a transcendental one. It's just a question, and a question if somebody wants to make some comments. Thank you.
One thought I have in response to this is I think that, what counts as rational usually depends on a particular horizon. And so there can be a logic to a horizon, and that horizon is said to be biased. And so it can exclude questions about certain groups of people and therefore be the cause of violence and sin and create the underside of history. I also think that sin is irrational. And that's one way of understanding why the solution to sin is not a mystery in the sense that it's absurd, as sin is, but a mystery in the sense that it transcends our capacity to understand, right? It goes beyond not only the rationality of the sinful horizon, which suppose rationality horizon, but has to be directed in, right? But I do think that, and in that sense, it's great to criticize certain types of reason, but I still also think that once in the sort of transcendental approach I'm talking about, Lonergan does speak a lot about conversion and the sort of fundamental horizon you hope to have that is fully converted, is open to and desires to know the truth, and that includes the truth of what has been done to people, which was unjust and unintelligible, and what we must do in order to try to help. And the solution is the law of the cross, right? To live a life like Christ, which is to be willing to, take on suffering for the sake of transforming it, which you said reality is sacrificial. At least under the conditions of sin, redemptive love is, in a certain sense, of sacrifice, right? So I see that perhaps as a way of.
Anyway, to strengthen what Carlos says, it's one of the fundamental dualities in Girard's thought, which is the difference between the logos of John and the logos of Heraclitus. The logos of Heraclitus is sacrificial reality. That's what phenomena. That's what phenomenal reality. The logos of John, which is the creator of us, is only seen by us in its expulsion. That is, in other words, reality becomes available to us in its being. Now, and this I think is the difficulty, because that sounds like two equals and opposites. It sounds like something that could be taken to be either Gnostic or transcendent good and transcendent evil, Manichaean, but it's not, because it takes the whole process of us growing up and becoming capable of learning what, in fact, in the midst of the circumstances in which we are now, the logos of creation actually looks like. And unfortunately, as you say, that usually means giving ourselves away sacrificially. What looks like a sacrifice, but is in fact the reverse of the parody of good pursuit. That involves trying to understand the depth of what is being brought up and brought into being, but not as something that can be then hold on to and say, yeah, that's what human flourishing looks like in some innocent Aristotelian sense. We get that on the way to following the one who is thrown out. And I think that that's a very, very, it's a very fine distinction. Very, very, very.
Okay, this marks the end of this panel. I think we're going to take a break, and the next event we have is the keynote from James Allison at noon. Perfect. Yeah. Thank you.